I get the privilege to introduce a couple of folks to talk about investing in the Heartland, startup to scale up. And when I hear the word scale up, I think about a comment that I just love from one of Walmart's former CEOs when he talked about scale. And he said, you know, with scale, you automatically get all of the negative sides. They come no matter what. But to get any of the positive benefits that come with scale, you really do have to work at it. And I think that that's absolutely true because, you know, as you get big, things get hard. And there are some opportunities that come along with getting big, but you really do have to work for them. And the other thing I think about when it comes to investing in the Heartland is how do you measure success? And are there different measures of success that might be appropriate when you're thinking about place-based investing, in addition to, or maybe even in lieu of, the traditional investment metrics? And I'd say investment metrics that you sort of would be familiar with in just about any kind of investment context are very relevant and very important and really shouldn't be thrown out the window and should be regarded. But there are also other ways to think about it as well. And I'd just offer two that Tom and I have kind of talked about as sort of metrics, and they're almost like anecdotal metrics for whether or not we're succeeding. And one of them would be, are people moving to your region who don't have a job? Or are people that lose a job or leave a job looking for another job in that region? And that really goes to like the desirability of your region. And I think there's almost no better litmus test for desirability than meeting people who are moving to your region without the opportunity to work, you know, day one. And so that's one. And the other sort of anecdotal piece of evidence that we look at when it comes to kind of how our investments are paying off is there outside capital that's also coming into the region? And by that I mean, are people from, you know, not here investing in this place? And are they doing it because they see the opportunity that we also see? And on that one, you know, I'd say some years ago, not very long ago, that was not happening, and it is more and more today. It's still small, but you can start to see positive trends along those lines. And so, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of other ways to think about impact investing and social investing and how you measure the kind of impact you're trying to have. I think it's absolutely critical that you don't lose sight of the traditional financial metrics when you are investing, but thinking about, you know, ways to detect progress and impact in anecdotal or even non-traditional ways, I think is important. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Steve Case up. Rise the Rest Fund, we heard from Steve last night, and Wendy Gillis from the Kauffman Foundation, President and CEO.
All right, Steve, this feels familiar.
We meet again.
I know. We did this a couple years ago in Kansas City, and always great to spend time with you. So I loved your comments yesterday as we kicked things off, and I think you set a really good tone and issued this great rallying cry about potential of you know, the Heartland. But it got me kind of thinking, you know, if you think back a decade or two ago, would you have ever imagined yourself being this kind of brand and strong advocate for fueling startup growth in the middle of the country?
No. And obviously, it's there are a lot of people doing including a lot of people in this room have been doing a lot of work in this area long before we got involved. And of course, the Kauffman Foundation has been the leader for half a century around kind of promoting entrepreneurship. But I kind of, as you know, stumbled into it a little bit. I had the great fortune of being part of the whole internet revolution, and when we started Americon AOL in 1985, only 3% of people were online, and they're only online 1 hour a week. And we said we wanted to get America online, get the world online. That was kind of a 20-year journey about building those networks and connectivity. And it's really in the last decade or so, where, including when we, the Case Foundation, which my wife Jean runs, and the Kauffman Foundation kind of put together this initiative, I think it was 8 years ago, called the Startup America Partnership. I started spending more and more time on this, and that when I realized the data, some of which I talked about last night, I said, like, this is a problem. We got to jump in and do something about it. So it's been great to see over the last few years, particularly the last year or so. I'm not sure we're quite at a tipping point, but at least there's a conversation happening now around regional entrepreneurship and the opportunities, some of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So I think we're making progress. But as I said last night, the data from last year suggests that the 19 Heartland states last year got 5% of venture capital, and California alone got 50% of venture capital. So it's certainly not time to spike the football. We have a lot more work ahead.
Right, right. Well, one great thing among many that came out of the Startup America Partnership was the Startup Champions Network, which lives on today. So that was good work. So tell me about the moment, if you can think of a moment, when you decided, I'm going to get on a bus. I'm going to drive around the middle of the country and see what's there. How did Rise to the Rest really get started?
The Rise to the Rest specifically about 5 years ago, because of the work with Startup America, and I was also asked to, probably 9 or 10 years ago, to co-chair something in Washington called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and that led to things like Startup America, led to things like the Jobs Act, the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, that updated the securities laws around raising capital for startups. And so I was kind of focused on sort of the policy side of things, and I just felt that it was time to hit the road, and instead of just talking about it at, I guess, a 40,000-foot level, talking about it like at the 1 foot level. And the first, we've done 7 these tours, 10,000 miles, 38 cities. But the first one was important because the first tour we did, the first city we visited was Detroit. And we did that on purpose because we realized that in many ways, Detroit, a century ago, was Silicon Valley. It was the most innovative city in America. And people were flocking to Detroit. Everybody wanted to be part of the automobile revolution. That was like the hot technology of the day. And it was growing crazy, and roads were being built, and schools were being built, and houses were being built, and it was rocking and rolling. And then, for a whole host of reasons, kind of lost 60% of its population over a half a century, and then went bankrupt. Like, wow, that's sort of kind of the leader of the pack to kind of losing most of its population and going bankrupt. That's pretty sobering. Now it is, as you know, fighting its way back, and there's great things happening in Detroit. So there's a renaissance now happening. But that was a pretty vivid, sobering, maybe even scary example of what happened. If you got this right, and by the way, 100 years ago when Detroit was kind of like Silicon Valley was fruit orchards. They were growing fruit. They weren't growing startups. So these things can change. And even if you look at the arc of the history of the country, and I talked about a little last night, there was the agricultural revolution, and some of the great cities were built based on that. Then there's industrial revolution. Another set of great cities were built on that. The technology revolution, another set of cities were built on that. There's a natural kind of rhythm to this. And the question is how do you continue to lead? How do you continue to innovate? How do you continue to do that in a way that is more inclusive of different kinds of people and different kinds of places? So it was sort of iterative. It wasn't like I woke up one day and said, I should get on a bus. But after seeing firsthand what was in Detroit, we also went to, I think on that tour, Nashville, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. We said, something happened in here, and by showing up, we can play a little bit of a role in convening and connecting and championing and celebrating what's happening there. And then we started doing more of these cities. We said, we think there's actually a role to play in connecting these different cities and connecting the entrepreneurs and connecting the venture capitalists and connecting the startup, community builders. So there is more of a network effect, which is why it dawned on me just a few years ago that this is for me like 40 years ago. The early days of the internet, nobody believed in what we were doing. It seems silly now because, of course, we couldn't live without the internet and smartphones and so forth. But it was a decade of talking about this idea before finally it took off, and people had good rationale why it wouldn't work. That, like, you really think like normal people will buy a personal computer for like $2,000 and go to the trouble of plugging in this communications modem and then spending like $10 an hour to be connected and figure out how to use this communications software. So when they get online, they can type a message to somebody. When they can just pick up the phone and call them. Do you really think that's like a mainstream thing? And in those early days, it was hard. It was expensive. And if you actually went to the trouble of getting online, there was nothing to do and nobody to talk to. It took a while. You had to create that critical mass, and it was about creating networks. Similarly, when I talk about the rise of the rest, getting a little bit better, but I talk to a lot of folks in a lot of places, including a lot of friends in Silicon Valley, and I see the same skepticism in their eyes that I saw 40 years ago, that they say, oh, that's nice. But and JD was talking about this earlier, but no, we really don't think that there are great entrepreneurs in Arkansas. We think great entrepreneurs are in like California. And so there's skepticism in there, but just as I'm pretty confident, with those early days of the internet, eventually it would happen. It took longer than I expected. It was harder than I expected, but eventually it happened. I think the same is true with Rise of Rest. I think it will take a while. It will be a struggle, and everybody in this room is part of that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But I'm confident that we will, in fact, level the playing field and be able to champion more entrepreneurs and help rebuild or build more communities, and we'll create a more connected country. And I also recognize that we kind of have to, because I don't think we have a plan B. This has to work. Otherwise, things are going to really go off the rails.
I'm sure you've made, we've got a lot of great stories about investments you've made, and I'm sure you would love them all equally, but people love stories. Do you have any that kind of stand out that surprised you?
Well, it's a tough question because it's sort of like cities. We got involved in this a couple weeks ago with Forbes. We pushed them because Forbes loves to do these lists, and they get a lot of attention. We pushed them for a couple of years to do like a Forbes list of rising startup cities, and so finally they agreed to do it, and they announced it a couple of weeks ago. And they wanted to just pick 10. We said, why don't you pick 20? A little bit more inclusive, but they ended up picking 10. And it was a pretty good list, but it might have tweaked it a little bit. But so it's always hard to you have multiple children. We don't want to say we love this city more than that city. And we've now backed through our Rise the Rest fund 100 entrepreneurs in 50 different cities and 35 different states. So we do, in fact, love them all. But I would just, as examples, which are really more examples of what's interesting about what's happening in some of these cities. You heard a little bit about this this morning, Chattanooga. I didn't know this till we visited, but it's kind of like Silicon Valley for trucking. A lot of trucking companies are headquartered there, and this company, Freightwaves, kind of doing a Bloomberg kind of data system for the trucking industry is based there, and they were a winner of our Rise the Rest pitch competition and have gone on to raise a bunch of capital. That was interesting to see. A company we backed in Detroit about 3 years ago, had 3 people at the time. Now it's 350 people, a company called StockX, which is sort of a marketplace with authentication for a variety of different products, growing like crazy. Probably have 1,000 employees within 2 years. That's it surprises people. There's a company in Baltimore called Catalyte, focused on education technology, using AI to identify people who have an aptitude for coding, but nobody ever told them that. So including some of the people they brought through their programs were like UPS truck drivers. Yeah. And they take this, go through this test, and not that many people pass it, but if you do pass it, they put you through this coding school and then guarantee you a job at usually a substantially higher salary. They're growing like crazy. A year ago, they're about a $20 million run rate. Probably end of this year, early next year, will be a $100 million run rate in Baltimore. We're seeing this everywhere, where every city has this developing startup community. There are entrepreneurs in every city. We're just trying to find them and back them and champion them and help tell their stories and help drag some of that venture capital that's sitting on the coast to recognize that it is worth their while to get on a plane and go to some of these cities. And we're beginning, as I said, to make some progress, but hopefully over the next 5 or 10 years, it really will accelerate. My hope is because we're off the record here, I never want to make predictions, but my hope is in the next 5 years, probably it'll take longer, but I hope in the next 5 years the venture capital going to those top 3 states will go from 75% to 50%, which means the other 47 states on average are doubling the venture capital. These states like Arkansas and others are doubling the venture capital over the next 5 or so years. That's doubling the number of startups, which are kind of like shots on goal. You increase your odds of successful, iconic companies if you have more startups, and some of them turn into speed-ups, and some of them turn into iconic Fortune 500 companies like Walmart. How do we get more of those going in more places? So I think that would transform these communities, transform the country. So hopefully that will happen. My colleagues tell me that is overly optimistic, and so never say it. But I just did, so now help me make it true.
I mean, clearly you're trying to catalyze something beyond the investments you make, and you kind of alluded to that. So beyond, moving venture capital and spreading it more evenly across the country, what else would you look for in terms of knowing that something catalytic is happening in these communities? What other benchmarks would you look toward?
Well, there's some benchmarks nationally, and then there's benchmarks locally and even regionally. And you've heard about some of them. Stuart just talked about one key one is watching the flow of talent. As I said last night, over the last half century, I believe every state, I don't have the data, but every state in the Heartland and most states in the country have seen an enormous brain drain. And just think about your own families. How many, there's a lot of people who love their cities, love their regions, and would actually love to have their kids stay there, but actually have encouraged them to leave. Like, there's more opportunity there than there is here. And that's happened in most parts of the country. And because all that capital, particularly if you're focused on the technology, innovation, startups, the sense is you got to go there or you got to go there. That brain drain has been huge. So slowing that brain drain is critical. Creating a boomerang of talent, of people returning, is critical. Also creating a momentum and almost create a magnet, which gets people, as Stuart was saying, who didn't necessarily have a connection there to say, I want to be there. The talent thing is huge, and there's obviously an intersection between the capital and the talent. And it's true that capital follows talent, but it's also true talent doesn't go there if there's no capital there. Right. And getting other investors to pay attention to what's happening in cities is important. Obviously, it's the core of what we're trying to do. But other investors in other places aren't going to believe in your city and your entrepreneurs in your city if you don't believe in those cities and you're not backing those cities. So that aspect is critically important. The other one that's critically important, and several people have mentioned this, is connectivity, collaboration. This my biggest surprise in visiting all these different cities is how much work we still need to do in all the cities we visited to create what in Silicon Valley they call network density. Silicon Valley is hyper-connected, hyper-collaborative, and in most of the places in this country are not. And an example is we were in Nebraska and Omaha in the morning and Lincoln in the afternoon, and it's about 45 minutes or an hour between them. So on the bus, we invited some of the most successful entrepreneurs in from Omaha and Lincoln to join us, have a discussion. And at the end, as we were kind of rolling in, I said, so how often you get together to talk about things and share perspectives and so forth? And there was a little bit of just a weirdness to the question. And then somebody said, well, to be honest, most of these people I've never met. You're in Omaha, and there's not that many entrepreneurs doing things. How can you? You're in Lincoln. How could you not? But that's an example of the need to create those connections. And so driving that network density is huge at a local level, and then creating networks more broadly by, as I said before, how do you network the entrepreneurs together? We had a summit 2 or 3 weeks ago in Chicago with the 100 entrepreneurs we backed, and some of our partners, investors, like Eric Schmidt and Jim Breyer and Derek Kowski and Brad Keywell, Dan Gilbert, people like that were part of it. How do you bring those entrepreneurs together so they can learn from each other? How do you bring the regional venture capitalists together so they can learn from each other and work together and maybe even share diligence, syndicate deals? How do you bring together, as you do a lot of work with the Kauffman Foundation, some of the startup community leaders so they can learn from it? So it's about building those networks, which is critical, which is why it does feel a little bit like Back to the Future for me, because that was essentially where I started in the 80s, just trying to build the internet networks to to connect people. So there's reason to be optimistic, and I am optimistic, but there are tremendous challenges. I would point several resources for people who want to follow up. One is on the Rise the Rest website, there is a report we put out called the Ecosystem Playbook, or just search on RiseRS Ecosystem Playbook. The Kauffman Foundation has amazing resources as well. And the Case Foundation, we published something a number of years ago called The Short Guide to Impact Investing. So this idea of backing companies that are first and foremost focused on profit, but also have a broader purpose. Those are some resources that that I think are worth looking at.
Yeah, that's great. We have a range of people in the audience. I'm sure we have entrepreneurs, investors. What, kind of going to the entrepreneur side, the other side of the equation, what advice would you have for startups here in the middle of the country that are having a hard time accessing capital?
Just keep fighting. It was hard for me to raise capital for AOL. It was a real struggle. None of our venture capital came from, we were started in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. None of it came from our region. Most people, as I said, didn't believe in the idea of the internet. We raised $1 million to kind of get going. It was hard, and we got money from Toronto and Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. It was hard. And even when we went public, AOL was the first internet company to go public in 1992. We raised $10 million in our IPO. And when we were on the roadshow, nobody cared what we were doing. It's like, what are they doing? It was like some computer thing. It seemed like a small market. It was hard to get people to believe in the idea of the internet. So you have to believe in what you're doing and be passionate about it and have a certain fearlessness in terms of pursuing it and never give up. You just keep fighting and try to figure out ways to connect to other folks, which is why these networks are so important. Somebody somewhere can help you, whether it be as a customer, as a mentor, as an investor, as whatever. And so I think it's really kind of taking that view that this is what most entrepreneurs do. That of course they're challenges, of course they're impediments. We almost went out of business 2 or 3 times before we finally kind of got traction. But the great entrepreneurs say, okay, well that's kind of a problem, but I'm either going to kind of knock that wall down or go around the wall, or just somehow I'm going to figure out some way to. And sometimes the crises are actually doors opening that create opportunities if you can have that perspective. And one specific example in our case, we had our whole strategy in the early days, because we had very little venture capital, was to partner with PC manufacturers. We did deals with Apple and IBM and Radio Shack and Commodore, folks like that. And our most important partnership was with Apple. We'd done a deal to license their brand name, and we had this service called Apple Link Personal Edition, which we launched, I think it was 1987, 1988, something like that. And we thought this was like going to make the company. And we launched the service, and Apple called one day and said, we want to tear up the contract. We've decided we don't really like the idea of you having our brand name. We don't really like the idea that you're trying to give your software away. We're trying to sell software through authorized Apple dealers, a whole bunch of things. And eventually we parted ways. And we're like, most people in the company thought, the company's going to go under. This is it. We're done. Turned out that led us to say, okay, we can't call it Apple Inc. What do we call it? A little internal contest, because we couldn't afford a branding agency. And it turned out America Online was the name we went with, and we relaunched with America Online, and a few years later, kind of things took off. But most people viewed that as the end of the line. For us, it turned out to be the beginning of a dramatic acceleration. So that's the other perspective I think entrepreneurs need to bring to bear.
Yeah. The counter's telling me we have time for one question, a quick one. So data that we gather at the Kauffman Foundation shows that every month, 3 out of 1,000 people are starting a business. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you add that up over the millions of people in the country, it's a significant number. But that leaves 997 people that aren't starting a business, but who can help the 3 people who are. So my last question to you is, what can those of us in the audience do to help startups in the middle of the country?
Well, first of all, the fact that you're here, you care about this issue, and you're doing something. So first of all, thank you for doing that. I would then respectfully, say, maybe beg, that whatever you're doing now, do more. This is a moment. I think, this is, as I've said several times, the entrepreneurs need it, your cities need it. If you look at the data on the kind of the way this works, half of the Fortune 500 turns over every 25 years. So if you're not planting the seeds, like the seed corn, these little startups today, you're not going to like your community 25 years from now, because things are going to happen, and some will win and some will lose. But you've got to kind of. So how do you create a mentality around that, a culture around that, and really do everything you can to support your entrepreneurs and to create a more vibrant startup community? It's so important to the future of your community, and it's so important to the future of the country. So thank you for doing what you're doing. I don't know what each of you are doing, but obviously you're here, so you're doing something. But maybe now's the time to double down. Let's leave everything on the field and say this next 5 years is make or break, and how do we wake up every morning saying, what more can I do today to make sure the entrepreneurs in my community and other people want to be part of that the startups, and it's not just the startups themselves, by the way. For every startup job, there's 5 other jobs created in the community, people building houses and working at restaurants and other kinds of things. How do you say, this is the moment, instead of observing the problem, kind of be part of the solution, right, and do it with a vigor that will surprise you and help lift up your community and change the face of the country.
Right. Perfect way to end. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you all.
Yes.